There is nothing worse than potential unrealized. We all have things that hold us back. What if we could find a way to get us unstuck? I'm Lachelle Weemy, and I am going to walk alongside you as you make the decision to get unstuck. Tune in as I help you realize that you are not alone, inspire hope, and offer practical solutions to help you step boldly into the life that you are meant to live.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Unstuck Podcast. And today I get a chance to introduce you to my new friend, Sara Brand. Girl, I have to just tell you that our friend Tiffany brought us together in this mastermind that we meet on a bi-weekly basis. And the moment that we connected in that Zoom, it was like, oh my God, I've known this girl for my whole life.
Forever.
And so it's so interesting. Like, we've known each other for a very short period of time, but you feel so comfortable. Like, I've known you my whole life. And I knew right away that I needed you to share your story because you're so inspirational. And I know that there are going to be people that I care about and that are listening to this that are going to be inspired by your story. And so welcome, sister, to this conversation. I'm so glad to have you.
This is so exciting.
Okay, girl. So I want you, because I always think that you guys do such a better job of describing like who you are and how you serve people than I can. So why don't you tell people like what you're up to these days?
What I'm up to these days is interesting. I'm just about divorced. And I went through a very long period of ups and downs in my marriage and the self-discovery that led to what did the decision look like for me, whether I was going to stay in my marriage or to go.
Mm-hmm.
And I was already a coach at this time that I was going through all of my own obstacles in my marriage and trying to kind of figure all that out. And so what I'm up to these days specifically is I'm helping women, wives and women decide as they sit in the uncomfortable time of not knowing whether to stay or go. I'm helping them decide on what they can do in the meantime to work on themselves to get to that, to get to the point of confidence in their decision.
That's amazing. And I think that one of the things that stood out to me when we were talking and we first met is that you do not it's not like you go in and say, I help a girl or a woman decide to get divorced. Like, I give her the courage to do that. And that's not what you do. You do something much different. So talk about that a little bit.
One of the things that I love the most about my life is that my friends in my life, we have really good, authentic relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a couple of close friends who've also had times in their marriage where they weren't really sure what to do or where to go or if it was even going to work.
Right.
And I've seen examples of them put the work in with their spouses and have the best marriage possible.
Yeah.
And I also did the same thing, but it didn't pan out.
Mm-hmm.
And so I am not an advocate necessarily to tell people or to judge or say, get divorced or don't get divorced. Where I come from and how I understand how painful it is the time when you sit in the indecision. It's the worst.
Yeah. Yeah. And I remember you telling me that it's like, if you can't be happy, right, I'm just trying to paraphrase the things that we've talked about in the past. Like, if you can't be happy with where you are in your own skin, in your own life, then it's going to be very hard for you to be happy in a marriage. And so a lot of the things that you do is really try to figure out, is it the marriage or is it that there's something within me, right, that I need to work on for me? So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So there's a really big difference to me about, are you in an unhappy marriage or is one of you an unhappy spouse? And not even chronically unhappy, but maybe there's just a point in time where you're going through an unhappy time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we can bring the best version of ourselves into the marriage. It's two people independently, right, coming together. The idea in an ultimate marriage is that you both are independently happy, coming together, sharing happiness alongside each other, right?
Yes, yes.
I don't know that that's always the messaging, and it's definitely not what we've been taught.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So a lot of times we're looking at our partner to quote unquote fill the holes of, what we don't come to the table with, but no, that's just impossible. Because what happens if your spouse goes through a tough time and now you're left with these empty holes that they're no longer filling and they need, your support, it starts to crumble.
Yeah.
Yes.
So if it's okay with you, I'm going to take this conversation a little down the vulnerable side.
Sure.
But I want you to kind of talk to us about where you've been so that the people that are listening, and I think that you mostly serve women. Is that correct, Sara?
Correct. Yeah,
okay.
But even a couple nights ago, I got a phone call from a gentleman saying, I need help. I need a woman's perspective. What can I do?
That's
so absolutely. Yeah, I loved it. I was like, yes.
Yeah. What an insightful perspective that I wouldn't have even thought of. But that's so interesting that you got that question.
Absolutely.
So the women that are sitting here in this place, I think sometimes it's really hard to admit that we're failing and we feel like we're failing. I have air quotes. Like we feel like we're failing, but you're not. And you feel like you're going to be judged if the world that's behind your doors is falling apart and you don't want to have to admit that. And the reality is that we all have icky stuff behind our doors, right? It just depends on the season. It depends on the person. It depends on all kinds of things. And so when we are vulnerable enough to admit that we're struggling, it helps, I think, to open up to people who understand what it's like to be in our shoes. And so I would love to give you this opportunity to talk about your shoes and kind of your journey that had led you to this place and what opened your heart to serving in this capacity.
So, yes, I had about 5 years ago, right in the middle of we have 3 daughters. And so we're married at the time, and I went through a quickly of mindset. A lot of people might call it a spiritual awakening, but it was like the end of my first life and the beginning of my second. Like literally from one minute to the next, I was changed and I couldn't go back and I couldn't explain it. That time in my life was the kind of the birth of really looking at how my spirit operated differently from my spirit / soul. I'm just going to use those two interchangeably. Operated differently from my body and my mind, and how all three also work together. That led me in becoming a coach, but I was a habit coach first. I went to school to study neuroscience and how the brain works.
Yeah.
But that also led me to then ask those deeper questions about, well, wait, like, then what inspires the brain? And like, if I have two thoughts kind of going back and forth, which one is me? But then what's who quote air quotes for me, like who's the other thought?
Right.
And was really starting to try to really pick apart and look at where my authentic self is coming from. Is it this thought or is it this thought? Right.
Yeah.
And I started to decipher the difference about who I was born to be and authentically am, and then what was the program that was covered up over that because of how our brains work and thoughts and patterns, which is almost all fear-based, because the brain's job is to keep you safe.
Right.
And safe means consistent. Right.
Yeah.
Right. You know all of this from
I
your
love this. I'm
well.
like totally geeking out right now, you guys.
Right.
Like, this is so fun for me.
Exactly. But then I also at the same time was really starting to feel my triggers and feel like how my triggers manifested into feelings in my body. So I also knew, like, oh my gosh, like I'm authentically this person. My brain is trying to stop me from being the authentic person, but my body also is giving me all these clues about where I need healing, right? Yeah. So it was this huge epiphany of how to distinguish the difference. And how to apply it, how to override my brain. And so in this period of my life specifically, I wasn't the same person anymore that my husband knew or fell in love with.
Right. You were on this growth journey and he wasn't necessarily on that same journey.
Exactly. He wasn't at all. And he couldn't understand. It was like speaking two different languages. And a lot of times I couldn't even explain it to him. Like, I don't know, but I can't undo this. I can't go back.
Yep.
I have never been closer to God spiritually than I am now. And I had questioned that in the past. I had so many things, and I thought I was going crazy at times too, you know, all while trying to mother 3 very small daughters.
Yeah.
And then launch a business and teach people what I was learning. And so throughout my journey of growth for myself, that I couldn't stop. You can't help but continue to grab at and absorb all the beautiful things that life keeps, you know, showing up for you and giving to you and letting you see. And I became aware that we weren't connecting anymore on the level that I desired to go and wanted him to meet me at in order to continue to grow together.
Right.
So, and that was where I started to speak up. This was about 4 years ago, and say, I think we keep having the same fights, and we just don't seem to be getting in the same place.
Right.
We're only in the same place. We need to get to a better place.
Right.
And get these things taken care of. And for the first literally 2 years that I voiced that, it was like, it was an external excuse. Well, I don't think anything's wrong. It's just the kids are really little. It's a lot of stress right now. You know, we don't have a lot of money. I think that's what the problem is. We don't get to spend time together. And so I felt very unheard and very empty, and felt as if my feelings definitely weren't valid, because to him it was an outside circumstance that was creating these feelings, not the lack of connection that I was feeling.
Yeah. And that's really interesting, Sarah, that you bring this up, because I personally have gone through an extraordinary amount of growth in the last probably 5 years. And, you know, it's one thing to be on Facebook or Instagram and read this inspirational quote about, like, you know, if you're growing and they're not growing with you, you know, like, say goodbye. Like, that's one thing, right? To like say goodbye to like this high school friend who's not growing with you. But it's another thing to say to your spouse that you promised to, you know, grow old together. Like, I need this. I need this from you. And then what happens is that oftentimes we try to compromise by diluting down ourselves or putting ourselves in a box or making ourselves small in order for everybody else around us to be comfortable. And that is a miserable existence. I know from experience, right?
Yes.
So, oh my goodness, like, wow, what a journey, because you've been given this gift of this awakening. And I've been down that path, and as you know that, but we haven't talked about it a ton. I read the book Untethered Soul.
Yes. Yep. Oh,
and that was, I know, right? That was one of the first times where I really started to recognize that, like, connection to God and looking at our chatter inside of our brain as
your roommate,
observing
it your roommate in
right?
Your head.
Yeah. So instead of it being me, I'm observing it, which is really interesting, because that's like a whole, like, people probably listening thinking, what the heck, ladies? But when you can literally be in awareness of the chatter that's going on in your head, who is in awareness of that? That's you, right? That's your authentic self connected to God or higher source. And so, yeah, and then you sound wackadoo
absolutely.
to the husband or the spouse or whatever. That's like, what the hell are you talking about?
What are you talking about? Yes, I know.
And so that's really, really interesting. And that would have been really hard, because, you know, the people that you're most vulnerable with, the people that you're closest to are hopefully in your home, right?
Absolutely.
And so when you find that you can't be your true self around them, because maybe, and I'm not saying this about your husband or soon to be ex-husband, that he would ever make fun of you, but sometimes that happens, right? Where they're like, oh, what are you listening to now? Or, oh, what are you reading now? And that sounds weird, you know, or whatever. And so then you start to kind of close off, and you can't really be yourself. And if you can't be yourself at home, that's really hard.
Right. And to your point too, Lachelle, like, I I did try, like you're like,
Yeah.
like there's things like, to have conversations and it'd say, this was so interesting. And maybe, but
Yeah.
motivation is in behavior. Motivation is one of three big parts of
Yes. Yes.
motivation, ability, and triggers, right? Those
Yes.
are your three things that make behavior happen. And if you don't have the motivation, and motivation is usually inner motivation,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
not confusing motivation with fear. Like I wasn't going to give him an ultimatum, like listen to this, or
Right.
I wanted it to be an authentic journey for him too, if he chose to do that, alongside of me. But it's a scary place because at times I felt very much like, if I choose my growth, will I lose my husband?
Yeah. At what cost?
At
Right.
what cost? And my family is then broken up.
Mm-hmm.
But you cannot turn it off.
Yeah. That's really interesting and powerful. And especially as much as you know about the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And, the last time we chatted, we talked about the neuroplasticity, right? And how you can literally change, you guys, you can rewire your brain. You can rewire your subconscious. And so it's plastic in the sense that it is able to be changed and formed in different ways. And so sometimes, I get that kind of caught in my head, like it's possible.
Yeah.
So I can change, you can change, blah, 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 blah. But you have to have that motivation and that desire, and you can't change anybody else.
Absolutely.
You can only change yourself. And so when you know it's possible, but you also know that it's only possible for yourself and you can't change anyone else, that had to have been really hard as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had asked him to go to counseling. It was about 4 years ago. And the first 2 years of those 4 years, he said no, for a variety of reasons that I kind of explained before. But then I was able to get him to go with me.
Yeah.
And so for the last year and a half before we separated, we went. And then it came down to comprehension. And we were still on separate planes on that.
Yeah.
And so it was, although we had the power of an objective, a person in the middle, who was cheering us on and giving us homework and all these types of things to do, it at least took the pressure off of, it wasn't my idea, it wasn't his idea.
Right.
It was us doing some of these things together. But the depth of which we understand what the quote unquote work to be was still very different.
Yeah.
And so we kind of got to that place where he was like, okay, let's schedule time. Let's schedule time for dates. Let's schedule time for conversations, and let's schedule even time to have intimate moments, right? Physical intimate moments. And I was at the place where like, that to me was a Band-Aid. I needed to know why we didn't already naturally do that.
Right.
Do all of those things.
Right.
And his idea was we have to get uncomfortable and then it'll become more comfortable. And I just knew for me that felt icky, and I needed to know what was underneath, like what was the unmet need that was driving the behavior,
right,
for us to find so many ways to be apart.
Right. And so now you're helping other people through this journey. And take me down the road of a typical person that you've been helping, and what are they most commonly struggling with? What do they come to you needing help with?
So I notice a lot of the one word, and I've read it in the description of your podcast too, obviously, is stuck. They need to know, like, how do I loosen this? How do I get some movement forward?
Yeah.
And a lot of times they're asking the question of, how do I get him to ... And it isn't ever going to be about the other person, because we just cannot control anybody else. And it's not a responsibility to do so. And so I'm helping women who are taking their future into their own hands and shining a light on what they bring to the table, and where they can look at some of these things that they have learned through conditioning that we can highlight, we can unlearn,
Right.
and understand why we choose these things subconsciously, and then use the triggers in those moments to choose something
Let me
different.
ask you this. Are you a business owner and you feel like you are literally tied to your phone all the time in order to keep up with social media? You know you need to post consistently, but you don't know what to post, and you don't want to have to post every single day because it means that you're married to your phone. So then you're not consistent, and then business doesn't follow. Or maybe you have no idea how to attract your ideal client, and you want to find a way to get the right people to come to you. Oh my goodness, like that was totally where I was, and I had to take some time and research to find out what the heck I could be doing to make my life so much better. So here's the scoop. I have found a system that I've created a system that has allowed me to not only attract my dream clients, but it's allowed me to be consistent by planning all of my content for an entire year in one single weekend. And I've decided to offer it to all of you guys. If that is something that you would love to learn more about, make sure to click on the link in the show notes so that you can learn how to get your life back but keep your social media game on. So fascinating. That is so, and one of the first times that I really recognized how we have to own our own like part in things is it's not related, but it's an interesting book anyway. It's called Leadership and Self-Deception. I don't know if you've ever read it.
I've heard of it. No,
but he talks about being in the box and being outside the box, and you think that it's everybody else's problem, but even if it's 1%, everybody has to own something in the situation. And I think that so oftentimes we are hesitant to acknowledge that there is part of this that we own in some way. But I also love how you've been able to take your brain work and identify that oftentimes it's things that are in our subconscious that direct the behavior that is at fault with why we're behaving in a certain way or feeling a certain way. And so tell me more about that, because it's so super fascinating.
Oh gosh, I could go on for so long. The first thing that comes to mind that so I can continue in like the vulnerable conversation is one of the things that I learned is I am somebody who has a detachment style. So what that means is when I'm in a stressful situation, my innate action is to pull away from my partner. I feel like, oh, this is mine and I need to go figure this out, even if it involves my partner. Or even worse, a lot of times is let me go and I'm going to pull away. I'm going to create distance, right? Which obviously already sounds bad. You want to move towards your partner, but if something happens and we have conflict, I'll pull away.
Yeah.
So that I can try to logically look at the situation.
Yep.
And which means not think about my emotions, but like logically move.
Right. Right.
And in that process, I ignore my triggers, which first red flag, hello. But then also try to look at, I try to make meaning of things. Now I know a lot of people do this because we all have brains, but there's an attachment style that you go kind of out of haste of like, oh my gosh, there's a problem. We have to fix this. I'm the opposite. And I recognize that like, I need to put distance and I'm going to go figure this out. But in the figuring out, I have completely stuffed down my feelings, which are clues for your triggers. Try to think my way through things. And then through thinking that, I create a complete false narrative of the meaning behind what he did or didn't do or whatever. And then don't come back and talk to him. So I decide that I've solved my own problem by creating an illusion or delusion, right? Of what he did, why he did it, why he said it, or also how much it damaged me.
Right.
And that was glaringly obvious a little too late in our marriage, and I learned it because I watched countless times in adults around me do it, including.
Isn't that interesting? That is so interesting. And that is a learned behavior that whether you realize it or not. And I noticed that myself, to be honest with you, like I watched my dad when he had to have a crucial conversation with my mom, I remember that he would typically just leave because it was easier just to like walk outside. Like he needed some space, right? To go for a drive, whatever. And I have found that my first instinct is just to like remove myself from the situation because I'm basically just pretending that like it doesn't exist.
Yes. There's a difference, right?
Yeah. So it's just easier to ignore it, right?
Yep.
And then I can go back and forth between that and like, I need to fix this right now. Whereas my sweet, sweet husband is more of a processor and he's more of a thinker. And by me going and straight into his space, like, we need to figure this out. He's like, whoa, like I just need.
Yeah.
And so my point there being is that we come with baggage, whether we realize it or not. We come with ways that people, I love his parents. I love his parents so much. They're wonderful, wonderful people. But one thing that my husband will say is that he never saw his parents argue, ever. Now I know, because I'm not an idiot, that all married couples have arguments, but they chose to argue away from their kids, which is fine.
Yep.
But they never taught him how to have an argument and resolve a disagreement by modeling that. And so it's so interesting how all of this stuff gets sucked back here, right? And then it comes out in really interesting ways.
Right. And like the thing that I teach my clients, or even just put out in my messaging, is, you know, from when you're born till about up to 7.
Yes.
It's like you don't have discernment yet. You
Right.
don't judge. You don't do right, wrong. You don't do left, right. You don't do up, down. Like, it is what it is. It is the truth to you as a child.
Yeah.
So you don't, at 4 years old, watch your parents in the middle of everyday interactions and go, oh, at 4, like, oh, like I side with my mom, or dad, like that was, oh, dad's so great, or dad's a better listener than mom, or, you know, you don't take sides, you don't judge. What you accept is truth. You believe that these are the ultimate examples, and that is it. And so no wonder we just repeat generational patterns.
Yes.
And just end up thinking that we know how to be married because we saw it from our parents, but never really had the discernment at such a young age.
Right.
Know what was healthy or not.
Right. We just don't have the parts of our brain that are developed enough to be able to help us say, like, oh, I don't agree with that. So you can't reject, you can only accept, and everything is truth. And you don't have the ability to reason the context around it. It just is. Right. And that's really powerful. Okay, girls. So what kind of tools, practical tools, can you give people listening if they can completely relate your story? They're like, Sara, I am in this in between. I'm really struggling. I don't know what to do. I'm torn. I've made a commitment. I made a commitment to God. I made a commitment to my kids, but yet it's not working, and I don't necessarily want to raise my kids in that environment. And I don't want to model that kind of life, because if I wouldn't want my daughter to grow up in this household, why would I ever model this for her?
Absolutely.
Right. And so those are really, really hard, really, really heavy things that somebody has to go through. And I love that, you know, you're here to help them not go through it alone. What are some practical tips that you could give somebody listening to help them move in the right direction, at least?
Yes. So the first thing that I would say is, and I'll lead into the answer to your question, is if you are deciding, or you want a formula of like, when is the right time to go? If you are not sure, then it's not the right time. Period. The fear, the discomfort is a messenger for you right now, and so it's not time to make a decision. It's time for you to sit and look at what that fear is and what that message is for you. And it's just not time. So that's powerful. The first thing.
Okay.
And then with that is what I teach is not, we might not be able to relate on an external circumstances of my divorce or my story or whatever, but what I do teach is my internal process of what those years were like for me and how I got to the point of confidence in my decision. So in that time, especially especially when I know what else to do. I surrounded myself with great leaders through stories and books, podcasts, reading Instagram posts and Facebook posts that were inspirational, that taught me how to understand myself better. If any teachers are teaching you that to go do this or do something outside yourself or go have, talk to him or do this, I would say the best advice I have is anything that leads you back to yourself is what you should be looking at.
Okay.
The other thing that I swear up and down about is journaling. I will say that till the day that this body goes away and my spirit floats on. Is there were things that were shocking to me that came out on paper when I just allowed the pen to flow. And I knew it wasn't my brain. It was what I just needed to see.
Yeah.
And if there was anything that I could teach people to do is journal with the prompt, I noticed first. So if you're sitting down and you just want to look at what's coming up for you, by starting a sentence with I noticed, helps you create awareness and take a look at your behavior outside of the emotionality of being stuck inside of it. Those are the things that help you start to look at it from a different point of view without an emotional charge. So I noticed today that when my husband said this, I felt like this, right? Those are clues to triggers into things that may not be serving you anymore.
And when you say triggers, you mean just like things that trigger like parts of your consciousness that you don't even realize? Is that what you mean by trigger, or explain that?
Yeah. A trigger is typically a feeling of an emotion that you get from a thought on something.
Okay.
So the way I describe to people is everything starts with a thought. Right? Things don't actually exist unless you have a thought about them. And I know that sounds extreme, but it's so profoundly simple, and it is true.
Yes.
Things start with a thought. Then after thoughts, you usually have a feeling about something. And that's our brain's job, right? Is to make meaning behind something.
Right.
So we judge it. We want to describe it, right? So we have a feeling, right? A feeling that doesn't go back into homeostasis creates an emotion, which is basically a feeling that lasts longer.
Okay.
Right. And then we get kind of attached. We kind of think, okay, when I have this thought, I usually have this feeling. So now we're starting to see that there's some patterns emerging, right? And if even these emotions go unchecked, emotions can actually turn into temperaments. And temperaments can turn into your personality. So if you're constantly triggered and you get angry very much, you also may be described as an angry person. Or don't tick that person off because, right? Looking at the parts of your life that you get very emotional very quickly because it's a thought that comes with an emotional charge behind it. That's a trigger.
Okay, that's really interesting because that has happened so much that it just bypasses. It just gets there really fast.
It's almost like it's so stinking hard to catch it.
Yeah.
I think the actual, especially when you have a habit, it's under a second from when a thought happens to when a feeling can be known in your body. And that's usually what a trigger is, right? It's you have an emotion. So it's you might be hot, you might be angry, you might clench your fist, you might kind of feel a ball in your stomach, right? So it's when it's actually showing up in your body, which is really meant just to be communication.
Right. And it comes back to that awareness. Gosh, honestly, I could literally talk to you hours and hours. So we're just going to have to plan that again.
Yes.
Okay. So is there anything else that you wanted to share that you could, wisdom, tips, anything that we haven't talked about yet?
There are the things that you can do for yourself that I talked about with reading books, getting good information, journaling, listening to helpful, anything helpful, hints, tools, podcasts. I mean, anything that you can do. Obviously, I'm a huge advocate for counseling and coaching.
Yep.
When you have a separate person that is not involved in your life,
Mm-hmm.
My job as a coach is I find patterns. That's my job. And I see them. That's what you get. I get to, through having conversations with you and asking you questions and letting you talk a lot.
Yep.
I can find and see patterns in your life that emerge, then that I can help draw the awareness with you back to where those come from. When you can identify where those things come from, then we can start unraveling those things. We can start figuring out why did this emerge? How did this pattern emerge? Where did that come from? We can start healing those parts, and then we can start to catch them through awareness and choose a different outcome.
Yes. So you're basically teaching yourself how not to react like you were with the triggers.
Absolutely. Triggers are your best friend, really. They're information.
Wow.
They are hints to your development. They're hints to your spiritual growth. And to ignore them is really, truly like spiritual bypassing.
That is so interesting. And so those of you guys who are listening, you're like, every single time my husband, fill in the blank, I get so angry. And it's like, well, then that's just continuing to create more friction, right? And so when you can identify, that is so interesting.
Yep. So my job then is to ask you, I'm sure your husband's great, but I don't care about your husband. Right. So let's talk about you.
Yeah.
So what does that feel like for you? Where does that show up in the body for you?
Yeah.
Looking back at what exactly he said, and then even asking the questions of, who does that remind you of? Not your husband, but who does that remind you of?
Interesting. Oh my gosh. Sarah,
you can go back and back and back. And it almost always is going to come from your childhood.
Yeah.
So then the question is, what if I don't remember my childhood? It doesn't even, you might remember your childhood or specific incidences. You also may not. But what matters is that it doesn't actually matter. Because if you are getting a response from a trigger that isn't serving your life, I can still help. We can do it together. Unlearn it and choose something different.
Yeah, your body holds on to that, whether we realize it or not. That is so interesting. And like I said, I literally could talk to you all day long. Yep. I think that you are such a gift. And I think that, I'm sorry to hear that you've gone through this, but I think that your experience is going to help so many people. And I just want to say thank you for being vulnerable. I want to say thank you for opening your heart to people who are walking in your shoes that really need the help, and they need the hope, and they need the practical tools to help make their life better one way or another.
Yes. And that's exactly what we say, right, Lachelle? Yeah. Like you still have to become the person who can have a healthier marriage.
Yes.
Or you have to become the person who can complete their marriage and move on.
Yeah.
Either way, the work has to be done. Without doing the work, then your current state will stay your current state.
Yes. And your patterns will just continue to materialize. So, correct. Wow, girl, thank you so much for sharing your heart, sharing your wisdom. I will definitely make sure that we have all of the information for people to contact you and work with you and follow you on the show notes. Is there anything else last minute that you wanted to add that I haven't already talked about? That you wanted to share?
I have a lot of tools on my website, and I know Lachelle will put that wherever you are listening or seeing this.
Yep.
I also have an ability to work one-on-one, and I'm also doing a group coaching program starting in the fall, which is amazing from a support aspect.
Yes.
If you're in this place, to hear other stories, to gain some insight about other people's stories as well. It makes you feel like you're not alone.
Because
we all know that we aren't, right? We're just not talking about it, but you're not alone.
Right.
But it also gives a support system of people who are not part of your life.
Yeah.
Which is just very similar to a coach or a counselor as well. And we need those objective people.
Okay. I always end my podcast with asking you, my expert of the hour, what is one coaching question that you would like to pose to the audience to help them move forward?
One coaching question.
Yep. What question would you like them to ponder so that they can try to move forward?
I would say the number one question is when you have a thought and you catch it, ask yourself honestly, was that my authentic self or was that my brain / programming?
I love that.
Or even, where did that thought come from? And always your first answer is the honest one. Your second one is usually your brain coming in to cover up and to keep your soul safe. So if you ever ask yourself a question, or if you're ever asking yourself a question while you're journaling, or you maybe have a journal with a prompt already, the first thing that comes out is usually the truest, almost always, actually.
Wow, that's powerful. Sara, thank you so much for having this conversation with me, for sharing your heart, and I cannot wait to continue our conversation.
Yes. Thank you for everything you do, Michelle. Thank you.
Bye, hon.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. And if you know that you are made for more, and you are tired of being held back and ready to get unstuck and step boldly into the life that you're meant to live, head on over to LachelleWeMe.com, request an appointment, and be ready for me to walk alongside of you personally to help you step boldly into the life that you are meant to live. I'll be back next week, but before you go, don't forget to hit subscribe and enjoy these imperfect outtakes.